About 30 seconds into a jazz improvisation, something shifts, what researchers now call the flow state. The musician stops choosing. The phrases stop feeling constructed and start feeling like they're arriving from somewhere else. And the strange part, the part brain imaging has now begun to confirm, is that the more expert the musician, the quieter the thinking brain becomes. Not more active, quieter. Most people assume high performance runs on maximum mental effort, concentrated and deliberate, eyes on every decision. The research on musicians points the other way, and in doing so tells us something genuinely interesting about what flow actually is, and why certain people seem to fall into it far more easily than others. Flow, as a concept, comes from the psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who spent decades studying what makes human experience feel most alive. He described it as a state of total absorption, where challenge and skill sit in balance, self-consciousness dissolves, and time distorts in both directions. Most people have touched it briefly. Musicians seem to access it with unusual consistency, and research identifies music as one of the more reliable contexts for producing it. The question worth spending time on is why. One early answer came from a study at the National Institutes of Health in 2008. Charles Lim, a surgeon who also played music, and neuroscientist Alan Braun recruited 6 jazz pianists and scanned their brains using fMRI during live improvisation. The medial prefrontal cortex, a region tied to self-monitoring and self-conscious evaluation, went quiet. At the same time, the lateral prefrontal cortex, linked to focused attention on the task itself, stayed active. The brain was not switching off. It was reorganizing, dropping the internal critic while keeping the performance running. That study involved only 6 participants, so it belongs in the category of findings you hold carefully rather than conclude from. But it pointed at something real enough to follow. And here is where the story gets more specific. More recent work has started to show that this pattern does not appear in everyone. It seems to depend on how much someone has actually practiced. A 2024 study from Drexel University, led by researchers John Kounios and David Rosen, brought together 32 jazz guitarists with varying levels of experience and recorded their brain activity via EEG across 192 improvised performances. Each performance received a flow intensity rating from the musicians themselves and a separate creativity rating from external jazz experts. High-experienced musicians entered flow more often and with greater intensity than their less experienced counterparts, and during peak flow moments, the experienced players showed reduced activity in specific areas of the default mode network, the brain's self-referential processing system. The lower experienced musicians showed none of that modulation at all. The interpretation Kounios and Rosen offered is worth sitting with. Creative flow, they argued, involves 2 things operating together. First, years of intensive practice build a specialized neural circuit for generating musical ideas. What Anders Ericsson, whose research on deliberate practice remains foundational here, would describe as the accumulated product of thousands of hours of effortful, targeted repetition. Second, and this is the part that cuts against most conventional performance advice, the executive control network has to ease back enough to let that circuit run without constant supervision. The brain has to get out of its own way. Dietrich's transient hypofrontality framework points specifically to the basal ganglia as the structure that houses these automated skill circuits, implicit procedural knowledge built up through repetition until it no longer requires conscious direction. What the 2024 study suggests is that this is not a mental trick you can apply on demand. It's a structural outcome of deep expertise. The circuit has to exist before letting go can do anything useful at all. Without that foundation of extensive practice, reduced cognitive control doesn't produce flow, it just produces a mess. Consider what that means in practice. The instruction to stop overthinking isn't wrong, but it's incomplete in a way that matters. You can only productively stop overthinking once you have thought through a problem so many times in so many variations that the thinking has been consolidated into something closer to automatic. Part of what's happening here involves working memory. During flow, the demands on working memory appear to ease, not because less is being processed, but because the relevant operations have been sufficiently automated that they no longer need to compete for that limited resource. And the reason this whole state feels so compelling, why people actively seek it out, comes down in part to reward circuitry. Flow is associated with dopamine release, which is presumably why experienced musicians return to improvisation not just as a discipline, but as something that feels, when it works, genuinely good. Flow isn't the absence of effort, it's the downstream product of an enormous amount of prior effort that has become invisible. Forget the idea that flow is something mystical for a moment, because the 2021 fMRI work from Georgia State University adds another layer. That study, which involved 21 advanced jazz musicians, found that connectivity to the brain's executive control network weakened during improvisation, consistent with the earlier research. But the more interesting detail was that the same flow-related brain signatures appeared even when musicians were simply asked to imagine performing. A sufficiently trained brain doesn't strictly need the physical act to begin rehearsing the state that produces it. What the evidence proposes, taken together, is something fairly specific. Expertise builds a domain-specific circuit. Repeated practice lowers the cost of running that circuit. When cognitive oversight eases off, the circuit operates fluidly, and what the musician experiences from the inside is music arriving without apparent effort. That felt sense of effortlessness is genuine, but it rests on a foundation the outside observer never witnesses. A 2022 meta-analysis by Alameda and colleagues is honest about how much remains unresolved. Neuroimaging findings across flow studies are still inconsistent, with some supporting broad frontal quieting and others pointing toward enhanced synchronization between attention and reward-related networks. A pattern that also implicates the salience network, which helps arbitrate between internally and externally directed cognition. The neuroscience is moving in a coherent direction, but it has not arrived. The transient hypofrontality hypothesis, proposed by neuroscientist Arne Dietrich, holds that flow involves a reduction in prefrontal activity, but the more supported interpretation now appears to be narrower, a selective quieting of self-monitoring areas, including the anterior cingulate cortex, while task-relevant regions stay fully online. That distinction matters, and replication work is still ongoing. A 2023 study from Goldsmiths, University of London, led by Professor Joydeep Bhattacharya in collaboration with Jasmine Tan at Harvard Medical School, examined what happens in the brain during the period directly after a flow state in musicians. Heightened activity appeared in upper alpha and beta frequency bands and theta oscillations, which the broader EEG literature has consistently associated with creative cognition and reduced self-referential monitoring, particularly across frontal regions, where upper alpha is associated with creative cognition and beta with focused alertness. The researchers described it as the first study of its kind, which makes it genuinely interesting and genuinely early at the same time. One study is an opening, not a conclusion. What does hold across the research, though, is a consistent structural picture. Musicians aren't a special category of human being. They're people who have spent years building expertise in a task that carries personal meaning, that can be sustained for long periods without interruption, and that carries a built-in challenge to skill relationship they can adjust in real time by choosing different material. Those are the conditions research consistently links to flow, conditions that researchers like Stephen Kotler, through the Flow Research Collective, have worked to identify and systematize across domains well beyond music, and musicians don't stumble into them. They construct them deliberately, across years, without necessarily understanding what they're building toward. The deeper implication reaches beyond music entirely. Flow isn't a personality trait or a talent someone either has or doesn't. It's an outcome, and the brain finds its way there when the preparation runs deep enough and the conditions align. The role of the musician, and more broadly the role of anyone working toward this state, is to do the preparation until the preparation can be trusted. And then, as the 2024 Drexel research puts it, let go. If the relationship between deep expertise, reduced cognitive control, and peak performance is the kind of territory that interests you, that's exactly what this channel covers.